Chapter 6. The disappearance of Mr. Thorley, however, had caused no public disturbance on its own account, nor until it was bracketed with another disappearance, that of one of his pupils, Sir Mark Pikestaffe's son. The Pikestaffe case then became a daily mystery that filled the papers. Mr. Thorley was of no consequence, whereas Sir Mark was a figure in the public eye. Mr. Thorley's life, an enquiry proved, held no mystery. He had left everything in order. He did not owe a penny. He owned, indeed, considerable property, both in land and securities, and teaching mathematics, especially to promising pupils, seemed to have been a hobby merely. A half-brother called eventually to take away his few possessions, but the books and instruments he had brought into the lodging-house were never traced. He was a scholar and a gentleman to the last, a man, too, it appeared, of immense attainments and uncommon ability, one of the greatest mathematical brains, if the modest obituaries were to be believed, the world has ever known. His name now passed into oblivion. He left no record of his researches or achievements. Out of some mysterious sense of loyalty and protection, Miss Beak never mentioned his peculiar personal habits. The strips of paper, as the silken threads, she had carefully removed and destroyed long before the police came to make their search of his rooms. But the disappearance of young Gerald Pikestaffe raised a tremendous hubbub. It was some days before the two disappearances were connected, both having occurred on the same night, it was then proved. The boy, a lad of great talent, promising a brilliant future, and the favorite pupil of the older man, his tutor, had not even left the house. His room was empty, and that was all. He left no clue, no trace. Terrible hints and suggestions were, of course, spread far and wide, but there was not a scrap of evidence forthcoming to support them. Gerald Pikestaffe and Mr. Thorley, at the same moment of the same night, vanished from the face of the earth and were no more seen. The matter ended there. The one link between them appeared to have been an amazing and exceptional gift for higher mathematics. The Pikestaffe case merely added one more to the insoluble mysteries with which commonplace daily life is sprinkled. It was some 6 weeks to a month after the event that Miss Beak received a letter from one of her former charges, the most generous one, now satisfactorily finished with the bankruptcy court. He had honorably discharged his obligations. He was doing well. He wrote and asked Miss Beak to put him up for a week or two. "And do please give me Mr. Thorley's room," he asked. "The case thrilled me, and I should like to sleep in that room. I always loved mysteries, you remember. There's something very mysterious about this thing. Besides, I knew the Pikestaffe boy a little, an astounding genius, if ever there was one." Though it cost her much effort and still more hesitation, she consented finally. She prepared the rooms herself. There was a new servant, Lizzie having given notice the day after the disappearance, and the older woman who now waited upon the clergyman and the banker was not quite to be trusted with the delicate job. Miss Beak, entering the empty room on tiptoe, a strange trepidation in her heart, but that same heart firm with courage, drew up the blinds, swept the floors, dusted the furniture, and made the bed. All she did with her own hands. Only the full-length mirror she did not touch. What terror still was in her clung to that handsome piece. It was haunted by memories. For her it was still both wonderful and somehow awful. The ghost of her strange experience hid invisibly in its polished, if now unseen, depths. She dared not handle it, far less move it from the resting-place where it rested in peace. His hands had placed it there. To her it was sacred. It had been given to her by Colonel Lisle, who would now occupy the room, stand on the wondrous carpet, move through the air where once the mysterious silks had floated, sleep in the very bed itself. All this he could do, but the mirror he must not touch. "I'll explain to him a little. I'll beg him not to move it. He's very understanding," she said to herself as she went out to buy some flowers for the sitting-room. Colonel Lisle was expected that very afternoon. Lilac, she remembered, was what he always liked. It took her longer than she expected to find really fresh bunches of the color that he preferred, and when she got back, it was time to be thinking about his tea. The sun's rays fell slanting down the dingy street, touching it with happy gold. This, with thoughts of the tea-kettle and what vase would suit the flowers best, filled her mind as she passed along the linoleum in the narrow hall, then noticed suddenly a new hat and coat hanging on the usually empty pegs. Colonel Lisle had arrived before his time. "He's already come," she said to herself with a little gasp. A heavy dread settled instantly on her spirit. She stood a moment motionless in the passage, the lilac blossoms in her hand. She was listening. "The gentleman's come, mum," she heard the servant say, and at the same moment saw her at the top of the kitchen stairs in the hall. "He went up to his room, mum." Miss Beak held out the flowers. With an effort to make her voice sound ordinary, she gave an order about them. "Put them in water, Mary, please. The double vase will do." She watched the woman take them slowly, oh, so slowly, from her. But her mind was elsewhere. It was still listening, and after the woman had gone down to the kitchen again slowly, oh, so slowly, she stood motionless for some minutes listening, still intently listening. But no sound broke the quiet of the afternoon. She heard only the blundering noises made by the woman in the kitchen below. On the floor above was silence. Miss Beak then turned and went upstairs. Now Miss Beak admits frankly that she was in a state, meaning thereby, doubtless, that her nerves were tightly strung. Her heart was thumping, her ears and eyes strained to their utmost capacity. Her hands, she remembers, felt a little cold, and her legs moved uncertainly. She denies, however, that her state, though it may be described as nervous, could have betrayed her into either invention or delusion. What she saw, and nothing can shake her conviction. Colonel Lisle, besides, is there to support her in the main outline, and Colonel Lisle, when first he entered the room, was certainly not in a state, whatever excuses he may have offered later to comfort her. Moreover, to counteract her trepidation, she says that as she pushed the door wide open, it was already ajar, the original mood of elation met her in the face with its lift of wonder and release. This modified her dread. She declares that joy rushed upon her, and that her nerves were on the instant entirely forgotten. "What I saw, remains her emphatic and unshakable verdict. I saw everything. The first thing she saw admitted certainly of no doubt. Colonel Lisle lay huddled up against the further wall, half upon the carpet, and half leaning on the wainscoting. He was unconscious. One arm was stretched towards the mirror, the hand still clutching one of its mahogany feet. And the mirror had been moved. It turned now slightly more towards the room. The picture, indeed, told its own story, a story Colonel Lisle himself repeated afterwards when he recovered. He was surprised to find the mirror, his mirror, with its face to the wall. He went forward to put it in its proper position. In doing this, he looked into it. He saw something, and, the next thing he knew, Miss Beak was bringing him round. She explains further that her overmastering curiosity to look into the mirror, as Colonel Lisle had evidently looked himself, prevented her from immediately rendering first aid to that gentleman, as she unquestionably should have done. Instead, she crossed the room, stepped over his huddled form, turned the mirror a little further round towards her, and looked straight into it. The eye, apparently, takes in a great deal more than the mind is consciously aware of having seen at the moment. Miss Beak saw everything, she claims, but details certainly came back to her later, details she had not been aware of at the time. At the moment, however, her impressions, though extremely vivid, were limited to certain outstanding items. These items were that her own reflection was not visible, no picture of herself being there. That Mr. Thorley and a boy, she recognized the Pikestaffe lad from the newspaper photographs she had seen, were plainly there, and that books and instruments in great quantity filled all the nearer space, blocking up the foreground. Beyond, behind, stretching in all directions, she affirms, was empty space that produced upon her the effect of the infinite heavens as seen in a clear night sky. This space was prodigious, yet in some way not alarming. It did not terrify, rather it comforted, and, in a sense, uplifted. A diffused, soft light pervaded the huge panorama. There were no shadows, there were no high lights. Curiously enough, however, the absence of any reproduction of herself did not at first strike her as at all out of the way. She noticed the fact, no more than that. It was perhaps, naturally, the deep shock of seeing Mr. Thorley and the boy that held her absolutely spellbound, arresting her faculties as though they had been frozen. Mr. Thorley was moving to and fro, his body bent, his hand thrown forward. He looked as natural as in life. He moved steadily, as with the purpose, now nearer, now further, but his figure always bent as though he were intent upon something in his hands. The boy moved, too, but with a more gentle, less vigorous motion that suggested floating. He followed the larger figure, keeping close, his face raised from time to time as though his companion spoke to him. The expression that he wore was quiet, peaceful, happy, and intent. He was absorbed in what he was doing at the moment. Then, suddenly, Mr. Thorley straightened himself up. He turned. Miss Beak saw his face for the first time. He looked into her eyes. The face blazed with light. The gaze was straight and full and clear. It betrayed recognition. Mr. Thorley smiled at her. In a very few seconds she was aware of all this, of its main outlines, at any rate. She saw the moving, living figures in the midst of this stupendous and amazing space. The overwhelming surprise it caused her prevented, apparently, the lesser emotion of personal alarm. Fear she certainly did not feel at first. It was when Mr. Thorley looked at her with his brilliant eyes and blazing smile that her heart gave its violent jump, missed a beat or two, then began hammering against her ribs like released machinery that has gone beyond control. She was aware of the happy glory in the face, a face that was thin to emaciation, almost transparent, yet wearing an expression that was no longer earthly. Then, as he smiled, he came towards her. He beckoned. He stretched both hands out, while the boy looked up and watched. Mr. Thorley's advance, however, had two distracting peculiarities. That as he drew nearer, he moved not in a straight line, but in a curve, as a skater performing edges, though on both feet instead of on one. He swept gracefully and with incredible speed in her direction. The other peculiarity was that with each step nearer, his figure grew smaller. It lessened in height. He seemed, indeed, to be moving in two directions at once. He became diminutive. The sight ought by rights to have paralyzed her, yet it produced again, instead of terror, an effect of exhilaration she could not possibly account for. There came once again that fine elation to her mind. Not only did all desire to resist die away almost before it was born, but more, she felt its opposite, an overpowering wish to join him. The tiny hands were still stretched out to greet her, to draw her in, to welcome her. The smile upon the diminutive face, as it came nearer and nearer, was enchanting. She heard his voice then. Come, come to us. Here reality is nearer, and there is liberty. The voice was very close and loud as in life, but it was not in front. It was behind her. Against her very ear, it sounded in the air behind her back. She moved one foot forward. She raised her arms. She felt herself being sucked into that glorious space. There was an indescribable change in her whole being. the cumulative effect of so many amazing happenings, all of them contrary to nature, should have been destructive to her reason. Their combined shock should have dislocated her system somewhere and have laid her low. But with every individual, it seems, the breaking point is different. Her system, indeed, was dislocated, and a moment later, and she was certainly laid low. Yet it was not the effect of the figure, the voice, the gliding approach of Mr. Thorley that produced this. It was the flaw of little human egoism that brought her down. For it was in this instant that she first realized the absence of her own reflection in the mirror. The fact, though noticed before, had not entered her consciousness as such. It now definitely did so. The arms she lifted in greeting had no reflected counterpart. Her figure, she realized with a shock of terror, was not there. She dropped then, like a stricken animal, one outstretched hand clutching the frame of the mirror as she did so. "Gracious God!" she heard herself scream as she collapsed. She heard, too, the crash of the falling mirror, which she overturned and brought down with her. Whether the noise brought Colonel Lisle round, or whether it was the combined weight of Miss Beak and the handsome piece upon his legs that roused him, is of no consequence. He stirred, opened his eyes, disentangled himself, and proceeded, not without astonishment, to render first aid to the unconscious lady. The explanations that followed are equally of little consequence. His own attack, he considered, was chiefly due to fatigue, to violent indigestion, and to the after-effects of his protracted bankruptcy proceedings. Thus, at any rate, he assured Miss Beak. He added, however, that he had received rather a shock from the handsome piece, for, surprised at finding it turned to the wall, he had replaced it and looked into it, but had not seen himself reflected. This had amazed him a good deal, yet what amazed him still more was that he had seen something moving in the depths of the glass. "I saw a face," he said, "and it was a face that I knew. It was Gerald Pikestaffe. Behind him was another figure, the figure of a man whose face I could not see." A mist rose before his eyes, his head swam a bit, and he evidently swayed for some unaccountable reason. It was a blow received in falling that stunned him momentarily. He stood over her while he fanned her face. Her swoon was of brief duration. She recovered quickly. She listened to his story with a quiet mind. The after-effect of too great a wonder leaves no room for pettier emotions, and traces of the exhilaration she had experienced were still about her heart and soul. "Is it smashed?" was the first thing she asked, to which Colonel Lisle made no answer at first, merely pointing to the carpet where the frame of the long mirror lay in broken fragments. "There was no glass, you see," he said presently. He, too, was quiet, his manner very earnest. His voice, though subdued as by a hint of awe, betrayed the glow of some intense inner excitement that lit fire in his eyes as well. He had cut it out long ago, of course. He used the empty framework merely. "Eh?" said Miss Beak, looking down incredulously, but finding no sign of splinters on the floor. Her companion smiled. "We shall find it about somewhere if we look," he said calmly, which, indeed, proved later true, lying flat beneath the carpet under the bed. His measurements and calculations led, probably by chance, towards the mirror. He seemed speaking to himself more than to his bewildered listener. "Perhaps by chance, perhaps by knowledge," he continued, up to the mirror and then through it. He looked down at Miss Beak and laughed a little. So, like Alice, he went through it too, taking his books and instruments, the boy as well, all with him. The boy, that is, had the knowledge too. "I only know one thing," said Miss Beak, unable to follow him or find meaning in his words. "I shall never let these rooms again. I shall lock them up." Her companion collected the broken pieces and made a little heap of them. "And I shall pray for him," added Miss Beak, as he led her presently downstairs to her own quarters. "I shall never cease to pray for him as long as I live." "He hardly needs that," murmured Colonel Lisle, but to himself. The first terror has long since left him. He's found the new direction, and moved along it.